But yeah,
It's true.
so I do want to also acknowledge the fact that even though you and I are both sitting here in the West today, let's be real, speaking the truth here in the West can be just as exhausting, just in a
Oh,
different way,
yeah.
especially when you're confronting the kind of like liberal hypocrisy that wants to seem progressive. But then, as you mentioned earlier, they won't touch Islamism or Islam with a 10-foot pole. So I
Yeah.
know, Morale, you've called out that hypocrisy head on. I think that's why I instantly became a fan of yours when I saw one of your posts on X, formerly Twitter, that I could not help but retweet. And I wanted to ask you about that, the weird alliance between the Western left and the Islamist movements. Why do you think that's happening, and why is it so damn hard to get people to admit that it's dangerous?
Yeah, I think both movements have a deep aversion to national identity. That's what unites them. The left is highly influenced by postmodernism and post-colonialism, et cetera, these actually outdated ideas, which promise freedom of guilt through dissolution, the white guilt, with dissolution, no norms, judgment, or cultural superiority. Of course, this is irresistible for a culture that desperately tries to escape its past. You see what I mean? Like colonialism, and in Germany, it is their Nazi past. Instead of erasing guilt, but that's the problem, postmodernism outsources it. It replaces it through relativism. What I mean with it is if all cultures are equal, then no one can be blamed. If all truths are subjective, then no one can be defended. If all identities are fluid, which is a huge part of it, then national identity becomes outdated and dangerous. And this is very dangerous because this is actually where Islam and this left ideology converges. Islam, and you know that original Islam is a supranational project. It denies national identity and rejects customs, secularism, ethnic traditions. They Arabize the entire Middle East. So they want just an ummah. That's what they want. And the ummah is ruled by Sharia law. That's what they want, global ummah. I believe this is where they converge, and the left is completely oblivious to the fact, and we Iranians know that because we saw what happened with the left in Iran once Khomeini seized power. Thousands and thousands were executed. Is the Islamists aren't their friends. They don't understand it. They will kill them. But both ultimately, to wrap it up, both erase the identity of national self-determination and demand submission to a higher abstract moral order. For the left, it's a global humanity, and for the Islamists is the will of Allah. So I believe it's something along these lines.
That's really interesting, actually, hearing that perspective from you. It makes a lot of sense.
I'm delighted to be joined by Nuria Khan, who is herself an ex-Muslim and a women's rights activist.
The Sharia tenets are derived from the Quran itself, but also the Sunnah, so like the way of life of the Prophet. And he goes on further there to, call women impure, deficient in intelligence. The impurity relates to the fact that women menstruate, and so you're not allowed to pray or fast during menstruation. So they take something as simple as like a normal bodily function and they turn it into the most loathsome, kind of thing that women should be vilified for. And again, the deficiency in intellect comes down to the Prophet's ruling that a woman's testimony is half of a man's. So you've got all of these things combined with custody. Custody in Islam is once the child becomes 7, regardless of the best interest of the child, it just automatically goes to the man.
What I'd like to ask you is what the Quran says about non-Islamic women, especially because in the context of what we're talking about now, and we'll get on to that a bit later, but broadly speaking, whether or not having a huge influx of men from completely different cultures to our own is having an impact on women's safety, or is seeing an increase in sexual harassment. So I'm interested to know what the Quran says about how a Muslim man treats a non-Muslim woman.
Yeah, so directly again from the Quran, you've got the verse which addresses Muslim men. The whole Quran pretty much addresses Muslim men anyway, but the verse addresses Muslim men and it asks them to cover up their women. So that relates to only believing men and believing women, essentially, which are Muslim women in these cases. So within that verse itself, it says to veil your women and make sure they're covered so as to not be harassed. And essentially, that allows for all of this leeway where non-Muslim women who aren't covered or veiled in the same way are allowed or fair game to be kind of harassed or intimidated in the streets. And this is backed up by Islamic history. If you look into it, and if you look into the very origins of the hijab, it was to be able to differentiate as a marker between Muslim women and non-Muslim women in the history of kind of when they would go in to do night raids, or where they would, go into other villages or kind of have these battles. They would take the women that they were visibly not Muslim women, and all kinds of sexual violence would be perpetrated against those women. And you've got Islamic scholars, one of the most famous ones from the subcontinent, who's been banned in a lot of countries, but a lot of countries still welcome him, Dr. Zakir Naik. I think he's been banned on Peace TV and Islam TV here in the UK. But he openly says if a woman is not wearing the Muslim veil, it's okay to harass her, or she should not complain if she is molested or harassed. So it completely sets this delineator between Muslim women and non-Muslim women. And that's why you see elements of that appear in the grooming gang cover-ups as well, where disproportionately we see white working class girls being targeted, and the things that they were being called during these horrific, acts of sexual violence, that the terms that they were being shouted at and screamed at, and the verses of the Quran that were being used to justify the violence against them, all kind of stems back to this hijab concept and the concept of veiling and differentiating. People coming from cultures where a lot of these things that I alluded to earlier, things like marital rape don't exist within the confines of Islam. Things like consent don't exist within the confines of Islam, let alone what the kind of understanding we have of it now. So you've got a huge problem in terms of a massive culture clash and a massive clash of values altogether in terms of how they view women. But the issue is it goes back to indoctrination. So you've got, let's say, young men who have, absolutely no regard for a woman's body or autonomy or agency. And they think that, for example, a woman sitting with her legs open is asking for it, quote unquote. Or if you're wearing a miniskirt, you're asking for it, quote unquote. But then the other side as well is that you've got this propagation of Muslim women who, again, have been indoctrinated from such an early age to think that they need to be covered up, and anything less than that is also them inviting this to happen. And so they, again, as a believing Muslim woman, you're going to want to cover up and not take part in this moral sin. But what it does is it reinforces the belief that these men have, that they should only be seeing women who are covered up, and that's the only way that they can respect them. I mean, we know that even in Islamic countries, when women are covered from head to toe, there's still sexual abuse and sexual violence that goes on. I've seen it firsthand in Mecca itself, which is the house of God. But yeah, you've got this kind of Stockholm syndrome almost happening with Muslim women as well, which are reinforcing the beliefs of these Muslim men or men coming from Islamic cultures, for them to think that anything other than that is so foreign and in their mind debased as well. So yeah, I think that it's no surprise that people with such starkly different, and I would say diametrically opposed views come into the country. You're going to see a rise in all kinds of sexual violence.
It's interesting to me that so often the custodians of tolerance, the people who really want to push the agenda that we mustn't be racist, we mustn't be xenophobic, we mustn't criticize different cultures or religions, are so often middle-class white women. And I think to myself, if they understood some of the things you've been saying, they wouldn't do this. Do you think that they have got Islam wrong?
They've definitely got Islam wrong, because if they knew the true Islam, just the way that you and I are talking about things that are extremely problematic within it, then they wouldn't be, so like readily holding up placards and, calling for Islamophobia to be made into legislation of its own right and things like that. So once you peel back the layers of, from the outset, seeing the bigotry of low expectations, if you will, of, this is their culture or their values are different, or this is just Eastern culture in itself, then you really, can see how women and girls from Muslim households, like I was born in one myself, I kind of understand there's a lot of coercion and, emotional manipulation behind the scenes, whether it's from your elders or from the teachers in the mosque, or peer pressure from other Muslims, or the community policing in itself. And that strips away at the agency and the autonomy and everything else that they think that Muslim women have. And I'm not saying that all Muslim women are, are victims of this. Some very much are probably wearing the hijab and the burqa off their own volition. But primarily that's few and far between, and those are women who have been raised in the West and they know they've got added protections to help them. But in general, I think if, like you said, if the middle class kind of, I guess, liberal value champions were to read the Quran verse for verse, or just read the verse of women that's dedicated to women, that in itself can give you a sneak peek into how problematic Islam is for women. And then maybe they wouldn't be so kind of trying to stand by them, when actually that's at the detriment of every other kind of group in society. Because the second that we give special pleading and we give these these pushes and nudges into legislation for why we think Muslim women need to be more protected, or because they're more vulnerable than other minority women or something like that, it becomes very, very problematic when we have movements coming out of heavily Islamic countries where there is theocracy, and those women are saying we have zero rights, we don't have the right to education, we don't even have the right to speak loudly or laugh loudly, and I'm alluding to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in this situation, where they have completely erased women from society. Now, you can be, living comfortably in the UK and be a middle-class white woman and think that this is a problem that only happens in theocracy. Well, this is exactly what we would get here if we were to allow this to run amok. So yeah, it was the classic example of the Red-Green Alliance, essentially, where they tried to topple the Shah, and they managed to topple the Shah, but as a result, the Islamists came into power, which is not what the West, the left, were expecting.
What did they think would happen then? I thought they were like propping up the Islamists, like, go on, we will obey you.
They were propping up the Islamists for sure, but thinking we can prop them up and then use them. But it turned out that no, they were the ones being the useful idiots for the Islamists. So it was kind of like a case of they were feeding the crocodile, hoping it would eat them last. But they got devoured in the process, because within 2 years, there were thousands and thousands of executions that took place. Wow. And I guess it should be like a stark warning to any of these kind of, here in the West, what's playing out now, to like these woke or gay activists who are, holding up signs for free Palestine, that, you are going to end up with the same fate if they were to ever get into power or have you under their control, because the Islamists are not your friends.